Hello, everybody. I'm really sorry. It seems like I've been talking to myself. So welcome to today's webinar. And thank you so much for signing up and coming to listen to our experts today. I'm Colleen Theron. I'm the founder of Ardea International, and I will be your moderator. For those of you who know about Ardea, we are a specialist specialist sustainability business and human rights consultancy with expertise in modern slavery. And we harness our legal expertise to help organizations meet their compliance obligations and develop best practice procedures. We have online resources and training. So today we are going to be discussing what a good modern slavery statement looks like, drawing on the expertise of our three speakers. And please do tweet using hashtag MSA, and note that this webinar will be accompanied by a recording, so we can send that out to everyone. And also we have a special offer on a masterclass we're running online on the 5th of May on improving your modern slavery statement. So get in touch if that's of interest. I'm really honored today to be joined by Louise Nicholls, who's the Vice Chair of IEMA and ex-Marks and Spencer, Hannah Legrigo-Stephens, who's from the Rights Lab at Nottingham University, and Dr. Chris Bayer, who's from the Development International. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Louise Nicholls. Louise is the Managing Director of SISECO. I've said that wrong, Louise, you'll have to correct that. SISECO, who's advising a broad range of clients from manufacturers to retailers and startups on sustainability and human rights. She tutors at Cambridge on supply chain and sustainable management. And she's also currently the Vice Chair of IEMA and trustee of innovative food distribution charity Bread and Butter Thing. She has a long career with the retailer Marks and Spencer PLC, initially in food technology and more latterly as the corporate head of human rights, food sustainability and food packaging, with a successful track record of stakeholder engagement in 40 countries, from individuals, affected rights holders to win-win partnerships with NGOs. She has chaired SEDEX Global for 7 years and has held board positions with the Ethical Trading Initiative, Low Cog Stakeholder Oversight Board, Consumer Goods Forum, and the Temporary Labour Working Group, which was the precursor of the UK modern slavery regulator, the GLLA. So Louise, just to hand over to you, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you are able to come on. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Just bear with me 1 second as I manage to get my screen up. Hold on a second. Oh dear.
Do you want me to put yours up?
I'm just getting there.
Okay, well done.
This is the excitement for us all with using this different technology. Anyway, we're there. So thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. What I'm going to talk about is modern slavery is a crime, and do you know how your business can play a part in stopping it? And I don't know, I'm hoping that most of you do know that modern slavery unfortunately didn't end in 1833, and that people are today being bought and sold in the UK. So let's explore that a little bit further. And one of the things I normally say when I'm talking to different executives is I get them just to reflect on the morning that they've had so far. They've probably drunk some coffee, they're hopefully wearing some clothes, and hopefully you are today, even though we're in a virtual world, and you've probably used your phone. And that really, because of the complex nature of long supply chains, it's likely, therefore, you've probably touched 40 to 60 slaves already just in getting up this morning. And, you know, I think modern slavery is an absolutely heinous crime. And, you know, unfortunately, it's very much alive and breathing today. And where you're going to find it is particularly in areas where people do job roles which are perhaps less visible. Maybe they're cleaning the office after people have gone home at night. Maybe they're working on the night shift. Maybe they're working in long extended supply chains. You know, what we're talking about is not necessarily people who are, you know, chained up, but that they're being controlled in a physical and a mental way, which means that they're not free to go about what they do. In some cases, people don't really even realize that they're in a slavery situation, and therefore they can be very reluctant to seek help. So let's bring that to life a little bit further in terms of what we're talking about. It's estimated that there's about 40 million slaves in the world today, and that about 25 million of those are in forced labor associated with work. And that 16 million of those are probably being exploited in the private sector. It affects every single country in the world, and it's an incredibly profitable crime. And part of the reason why it's so profitable is that you can sell a person over and over again. And my big point here is that every business is potentially at risk. And part of the reason for running the webinar is to get people to really start thinking about where it might occur, rather than making the automatic assumption it doesn't occur. So let's just look at a few press highlights that customers would have been reading about, or citizens would have been reading about in the last 6 months. And at the center of this, I draw your attention to the terrible lorry tragedy of last October, where 39 Vietnamese lost their lives in the back of that lorry. And that's just a sign of how desperately people will move and migrate for the opportunity of work, and how that puts them in terrible, vulnerable situations. But if we just look at this, you know, from clothing and the kind of stories behind the Leicester sweatshops, to thinking about some of the commodities like tomatoes and cocoa, to thinking about on your high street corners, kind of car washes, nail bars, have both been associated with modern slavery, through to thinking about things like the recycling of waste, again, where you've ended up with third-party subcontractors who are actually using, in some cases, slavery as well. What we know is that in London, the number of slavery victims has gone up tenfold in 5 years. And it's quite easy to buy a slave in the UK, which, yes, seems shocking. But as you can see, there's a story there from the 19th of December about how easy it is in the world of construction. Now, I think in this particular moment in time, in a world of COVID, it's also worthwhile thinking about what new risks might be emerging in your particular supply chain that you haven't considered so far. And so when you come to thinking about your modern slavery statement, the whole thing there is to be thinking about what risks have changed since I last looked at modern slavery a year ago. In terms of the legislation, we've got the UK Modern Slavery Act. In fact, every law in the world has outlawed slavery and human trafficking. And in the UK, if you've got a turnover of 36 million, you're required to report annually. And this is a look at the kind of state of UK compliance, which is horrendous, that only 23% of the modern slavery statements have met all the UK modern slavery requirements. So it shows we've got a long way to go. And again, it's really important that people start really taking this seriously and not being quite so complacent. On the right-hand side of the screen is just showing you a kind of summary of the movement in terms of legislation. There are over 60 different bits of legislation around the world that are focusing on human rights, which will include modern slavery, as well as a kind of growth in kind of voluntary initiatives, benchmarks that are also starting to hold businesses to account. So if you've not got on the journey, again, there's real evidence that it would make sense to be getting on the journey, because this is about safeguarding your business and you know, giving yourself the best opportunity to be able to access future opportunities. So what did M&S do in terms of managing this? Well, what I did with every single business unit of Marks and Spencer's is that the director who was responsible for that business unit was given responsibility for managing and understanding the modern slavery risk in their business area and making sure they had the right mitigations in place. And what we then did was to identify a practitioner in their business area who would support the director with it, but it was made very clear by the CEO it was the director's responsibility. So annually they had to produce a business risk assessment, which meant that they needed to think about their own operations. And what we did was to overlay that with some workshops looking at external indices and stakeholder input to start to get them to really think about where that risk might apply, and then to agree what mitigations they were going to do during the year to reduce those risks. And that way it just made it very real, and I used press cuttings that were relevant to that business area to help them. What I also did was I got the CEO to write to every supplier and employee and the extended supply chain, like franchise partners, explaining that what was important to Marks and Spencer's was to find modern slavery and to rescue the victims and bring the perpetrators to justice. And in that way, it made people feel it was okay to air, I think I have this problem, what should we do about it? Because that was, you know, really important to give people the license to say modern slavery was okay to find. And so that was really important. The other thing is to relate it to the overall human rights issues. This is one of Marks and Spencer's salient issues, is modern slavery. With other businesses, when they look at their human rights issues, it might be that they discover that modern slavery isn't one of their salient issues, and that's okay. The point here is to make sure you're doing that risk assessment regularly to make sure you're really looking hard to find out where the issues occur. Key is to form the right kind of governance structure, and as I explained, so each of the different business units, the food, the clothing, homeware, logistics, each had a different director who had responsibility for that risk assessments, and then that fed into the human rights practitioner group and then into the human rights steering group, which then fed into the board operating committee. And I used to report a couple of times a year to the board an update on our process. It's really important to work with partners. The reality is it's very hard for us to know where the issues might be occurring and to understand what the challenges are for victims. So one of the things that Marks and Spencer's did was to sponsor the Modern Slavery Helpline. And you know, here's an example of the kind of output from the helpline that can be hugely helpful in terms of intelligence, in terms of what might be the things to be looking for, and then to look at whether or not your monitoring systems that you've got in place are looking at those particular issues and finding them. The other thing is it can be very successful is to work with social media. So one of the programs that Marks and Spencer is involved with in Thailand works with Project Izara, and that actually monitors chat rooms and social media as people migrate and looks for where hotspots might be occurring in terms of modern slavery. But partners are hugely important. Modern slavery is a much bigger issue than one organisation can solve on its own. And it's about working together with others. So in terms of the modern slavery statement, you know, what's really key with the modern slavery statement is, first of all, to be really clear what's in scope for your modern slavery statement. So you can see here on the front page, Marks and Spencer's describes what's in scope in terms of the number of territories, what we're talking about in terms of customers, product suppliers, farms, smallholders, and the fact that we've included both franchise partners, our own stores and international stores, and our goods not for services and not for resale. It is also really helpful to talk about what's the area of focus that you've had for this year, so that kind of again draws the attention for the reader. Important to talk about where you found the risk, and M&S makes a point of calling that out. And my main reason for doing that was because I wanted to make it easier for others who might be in similar sectors to see where M&S was learning. We also, quite unusual for a retailer, we talked about the number of issues that we identified in the year. And again, this links back to my point with the CEO about making it really clear to people that it's okay to find it, because what's important is about resolving it. But then having found it, what's important is to talk about it, bring to life some case studies of what did you find, what did you do about it, what was the result of it, what have you learned, and how are you applying that back to your monitoring process. again, to highlight the partnerships that we were working with and how they're helping support modern slavery, again, to help others who might be looking for it. And then lastly, to talk about the kind of key KPIs and what progress we've made during the year. So what are business leaders doing? What's really important is to recognize this is part of your overall human rights due diligence, is one aspect of it, is to set a commitment to tackle modern slavery, to put in place those policies and processes, to conduct risk assessments, and to put in place effective mitigations. And one of the areas that people are really focusing on is recruitment practices and making sure that people are not indebted in the process of getting work, because we know that in more than 50% of cases, the reason why people end up in slavery is to do with indebtedness. Is to really promote that social dialogue, get people talking about modern slavery, raising awareness, thinking about where it might occur, and making it such that victims feel that they're able to come forward and raise concerns with effective grievance mechanisms, and then to make sure that there's really effective process for remediating any cases that are found. So my last bit, what can you do to help? Absolutely raise awareness of modern slavery. It's a crime. It does potentially list in every company's supply chain, and it's a material risk. And as a responsibility, we've got the power to help bring the perpetrators to justice. And I think the most important thing here is to be proactive. For every slave that we prevent, we've got the same effect on a life as rescuing that slave. So the point here is let's actively protect rather than see this as just a compliance thing to be done.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Louise. That's really informative. And if anybody else hasn't got questions, I certainly have for you afterwards. So I just wonder if I could please introduce now Dr. Chris Bayer. Chris is the principal investigator and co-founder of Development International and has more than 15 years project design and execution experience. His current research, implemented through the German NGO Development International, which he co-founded, hones in on the impact of legal instruments that regulate industries in sectors tainted with human rights issues, including the Dodd-Frank Section 1502 conflict minerals regulations, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, and more recently, the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and the impact of the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains on of minerals from conflict affected areas. So Chris, over to you, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Colleen. Can I ask, do you have a visual of the presentation? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
And you see the presentation?
And we see the presentation.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you, Colleen, for this opportunity. And it was, of course, fascinating to listen to Louise present Marks and Spencer. Marks and Spencer, I think, is a paragon in so many respects. And I'm also aware of a fun little trivia fact that Andrew Wallace, who was, of course, instrumental in getting the UK Modern Slavery Act passed, was, in fact, alumni, if you will, of Marks and Spencer. So I think there's probably some untold stories there, but yeah, thank you for that, let's say, very practical and very insightful introduction to the issue, Louise, and of course, the nuts and bolts of how you are operating. Very, very interesting. We come at it from a M&E point of view, so let's say monitoring and evaluation, where we look at how individual companies are dealing with this law, but also one of the questions we ask is, how is the law working in terms of, what is the implementation, what is the uptake at a more macro level as well. And so together with colleagues such as Gordon Miller, we have launched various studies and league tables in which we assess at the macro level as well as the micro level. And so I would like to share with you a bit about our work thus far in this field and maybe some takeaways from that. So you might be wondering, what kind of a funny animal is this? I mean, when we investigate, let's say, any given company's representations of what they're doing vis-a-vis modern slavery. We're struck every time by the fact that, you know, every company is a unique animal. It's not created equal. Of course, you know, some of the examples that Louise was pointing us to, you know, you could be a bank headquartered in London. You think, well, I don't have traditional supply chains, but of course you still serve coffee in the morning, right? Or you know, your investments in turn could have huge implications for better, for worse, right? So I think in that sense, you know, every business is a unique animal. In this case, we're looking at an okapi, and you know, that's kind of a curious creature in and of itself, but it's good to keep in mind, you know, no company is created equal. So again, sort of the check boxing exercise doesn't quite work. Now, don't do as I say and don't do as I do, because we also use a quasi check boxing. So let me explain that. So in order to gauge to what extent companies are meeting minimum standards and to see what they are, you know, let's say path they are pursuing, we also have an, in quote, checkbox, right? So I guess at some point in the process, you will come across a checkbox either at a company level or elsewhere. But of course, we go beyond that. So, you know, the scorecard that you're looking at is just an example of a way to gauge whether certain things are or not occurring. Now, in our studies, we for almost every indicator, which is binary, we then go the additional step and ask, how is a company dealing with this particular, you know, point? So this particular indicator. So we ask the how question, and then we also try to collect qualitative data on, you know, to understand, you know, get a much deeper insight on all the modalities, you know, involved. So, but this just as let's say a basic framework. And so, you know, there's a common misconception that compliance is really only 3 points, and for UK MSA. And in fact, you know, we did very carefully look at MSA and realized that, oh no, there's definitely at least 9 minimum compliance you know, criteria that you absolutely need to meet, right? So let me just list them real quick. You have to have the URL on your homepage to your statement, has to be signed by directors, has to be approved. You have to either state whether there are or are no steps in your value chains, you know, either implicitly or explicitly. The same with your own business. You have to have specified your fiscal year period. You have to have an annual publication. You have to state the organizations covered by the statement, and you have to state whether the statement is pursuant to the UK MSA. I mean, that's just at a minimum what you really have to do in order to be compliant. And then conformance. So, you know, we break down any given statement according to these 3 dimensions, right? So conformance is whether you are meeting the so-called Theresa May clause, right? So companies may XYZ, right? So that's sort of a separate, you know, it's suggested, it's not, let's say, under the compliance rubric, but it's still something that you need to pay attention to. For anti-slavery, anti-human trafficking good practice, what we did was we looked at existing statements and we said, okay, let's just take a basic inventory of what many companies are already doing. And then we're not overreaching and we're not asking for too much, but we're saying, you know, what are some of the things that, let's say, leading companies are doing across the board? So where are the commonalities? And so, you know, do you have your value chains mapped? Do you have indication thereof, and possibly even a visual diagram? And I'm not going to go through all of these, but, you know, for example, do you have an employer pays policy? Do you have audits in your business? Do you have a year-over-year change vis-a-vis whistleblower channels? And so, in other words, we break it down into those 3 dimensions, and that I think it's also fair to companies to say, you know, to sort of put, you know, one set of indicators in the bucket of compliance, the next into conformance, and then the other into good practice. And we specifically don't use best practice because what may be best practice for one company may not be best practice for another company. And then also we have the problem of validation of best practice, which is another subject altogether. what we ended up, so this is the template that we used to use, and these 47 indicators which we used to pursue. And then we realized, oops, we have some learning to do, because what we're measuring, in fact, is not specific enough. It's not detailed enough. We're not getting down to a granular enough level. And it became very, very apparent with the recent BAT case, if you will, so British American Tobacco, which it came to light had up to 15,000 kids working in its supply chain, including Malawi. And now I think most of us are aware of child labor in cocoa, and Turkey also struggles with this in, hazelnuts, for example, and, the list will go on and on. But, I think it wasn't, let's say, public knowledge that there's also child labor in tobacco plantations. And so we then went back to BAT's statement, because BAT had done rather well with our 47 indicators, right? And we went back to BAT and said, looked at the statement and saw that they had identified 0 cases through their whistleblowing. So through they had said they had a grievance mechanism, but for the year in question, stated that they had 0 incidents of child labor and human rights violations in the labor sector. So, something was wrong, as in either it wasn't a legitimate enough system, or there was some other hindrance that would prevent people from using that grievance mechanism that BAT set up. So we had to get a lot more granular in order to meet, to gauge and to pick up really what companies were doing that was actually working, that was actually could be considered good practice, right? So we're right now, we've expanded the instrument that we're hoping to apply to 70 indicators. Those 70 indicators will include things like, were the audits of suppliers and providers performed by a third party? Is there an existence of a third party managed whistleblowing mechanism or grievance mechanism? And then, things like, are there actual incidents reported? Back to Louise's point, is we want to find modern slavery, right? It's the opposite of trying to stigmatize the existence thereof in your supply chain. You want to find it. You want to, I'm hyperbolizing, but you want to celebrate the existence of modern day slavery in order to be able to rescue and withdraw and so on, and actually take real action. Do you have a corrective action plan in place? And so we're getting a lot more granular with this expanded set of indicators. And so we hope to move forward with that. We also would appreciate your input, and we can I'll share in the chat box a URL to that link if you would like to input and maybe help us further refine these indicators. Then we also provide services, and we will also review your MSA statement once it's published for you. So with that, I would like to hand it over back to Colleen.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's really interesting, and I think some interesting points to pick up around the discrepancies perhaps put into modern slavery statements, and not necessarily having the proper procedures to back up some of the statements, and that would be interesting perhaps afterwards if we've got some time to discuss. So moving on to Hannah then, last and certainly not least, Hannah is the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Manager for the private sector at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham's Research Centre on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. Her work involves working closely with businesses to understand their modern slavery research needs, undertaking impact assessments of anti-slavery activity, and translating research outputs from the Rights Lab research programs into useful resources for stakeholders in business, policy, and civil society. Previous experience includes managing labor standards in global supply chains in the retail food industry, working on ethical trade, business ethics and human rights issues, and project management of specific private sector modern slavery activities to support awareness raising and improve victim support. Just fantastic CVs of all these 3 people. So Hannah, over to you, please. Look forward to hearing your presentation.
Fantastic, thank you. And just to check as well, you can see my screen and hear me all right?
Yes.
That's great.
Fabulous, thank you.
The
Great, well,
too.
thank you, Colleen, for that, and for Chris and Louise for fantastic precursors to this. I'll try and not be too repetitive, but add something slightly different. And my brief really today is to share how the reporting we've done at the University of Nottingham on standards of modern slavery statements over the last few years have changed, what we can find out from those, and what we can share as learnings for those new to it, for those really looking to improve, and for those really reflecting on perhaps how they could make a step change in their own reporting. So I'm going to share some of that work with you today, and hopefully some useful learnings and takeaways for you to implement. Just as a quick introduction, the Rights Lab is based at the University of Nottingham. We're a research centre focused purely on modern slavery, human trafficking and all kinds of forced labour. We're the largest academic institution focused on this around the world, with around 100 academics from many different disciplines coming together. We have research programmes on everything from survivor voice to big data and supply chains, to anti-slavery law and policy and community resilience to the issue. And existing research is all published on our website, free to download and use. And our biggest priority is working with stakeholders within the private sector, the third sector and policymakers to ensure what we do and what we output is super useful. So we always like to hear from those kind of stakeholders with the sort of end intent of finding out what works to end slavery. So please get in touch if you'd like to know more, and let us know what you need. So what have we done regards modern slavery reporting so far? As Louise pointed out, reporting with the Modern Slavery Act has fallen short for many years now since it started, both in meeting those basic requirements, which Chris touched on, but also in the quality and content. And we've undertaken a number of pieces of work at Rights Lab to understand who's doing it well, who are the laggards, and what exactly are they failing on. And understanding more about how people are reporting should be seen not just as highlighting those that aren't doing it correctly and appropriately, but also hopefully producing productive information that can be constructive to people who are genuinely interested in how to do this. So we've got a couple of key reports I wanted to highlight. I am speaking on behalf of some other very clever people who have done this work in the Rights Lab today. So just to call out, we've got a piece of work, for instance, that was done by Caroline in 2017 about the top 50 universities' modern slavery compliance. We've done a number of pieces of consecutive work, Andrew and Alex, in previous years on reporting within agriculture and other high-risk sectors like accommodation, hospitality, and it's going to be a mixture of those outputs that I talk through today. Just to highlight as well, a main key part of how we've assessed these statements going forwards is on the 6 elements you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. The points A to F are set out in the Modern Slavery Act government guidance. They're exactly what all 3 of us have talked about so far in terms of what you have to include from a content perspective. So if you're not aware of those in their absolute clarity and in-depthness, I'd suggest you go and investigate that, and hopefully after today's webinar you'll be even clearer on how you can create your statement and what you should be putting into it. So in terms of the sectors that we've assessed, some of you might have seen this infographic from the ILO on the left, which shares the types of industry most affected by forced labour. Removing domestic work in the green, the 24%, it's rarely addressed in corporate modern slavery statements. The next few sectors here are particularly relevant to many of you, I'm sure. And there are some common themes which generally bind together those extra additional sections and industries of construction, manufacturing and agriculture. Many of them include workers doing easily replicable tasks. It will be low skilled, often low wage labour completing them, usually on some kind of temporary or 0 hours contract that's not providing much security to that worker. And you know, we're operating in a context of severe worker shortages, not just in the UK, but around the world, where migration patterns are changing. And goodness me, COVID is having a massive impact on that as well. And I imagine there'll be an awful lot of reflection as time goes by as to what this means for various low wage, low skilled sectors as we move through the crisis. These common themes to vulnerability to modern slavery are relevant in all of those sectors. So just reflect on whether you've got anyone in your supply chains or operations that is in that situation. And something we always talk about is making sure that workers and the employer and the person is at the heart of why you're addressing this issue in your business. And just remembering that it's all about vulnerability and your responsibility as a business to ensure that vulnerability is reduced, which is why you're writing this statement. And before we move on to the results of our research, it's just also to highlight that I've always thought the term modern slavery statement is a bit of a misnomer. It should be called a modern slavery action plan or plan of action, because it should be a strategy document. It should be a risk register. It should be a KPI tracker, all in one. And if you currently consider your statement as a legal obligation and nothing more, I think now's the time to try and shift that behaviour. If you engage in the spirit of the Modern Slavery Act, it's much easier to see this as a live document that you engage different colleagues in. And you've got an intention to genuinely reduce the risk of modern slavery happening in the supply chains and operations of your business. So just to highlight, it's not a case of if you find it, it's a case of when you find it. And we've all got a part to play in using this act to bring the problem to life. So moving on, our research can be split into three areas of what it looked at. It looked at whether the statement existed, very, very simply, is it on the website and available and written? It looked at compliance, which, as Chris pointed out, has got 3 key points. It has to be approved by the board, signed by a director, and available on the company's website. And then we also looked more in depth at the quality of the statement. And the piece of research I'm mainly going to talk about today looked at agricultural sector statements in 2017, 18 and 19. But it also compared it to other high-risk sectors, which, as I've said, are incredibly comparable if you think about the type of worker profile you've got in all of those sectors. So what did we find? From an existence perspective, it's been quite a positive story. In 2017, only 51% of the statements of the organisations assessed had a statement. This has moved to 89% in 2019. However, I should caveat that if you looked at that figure, it actually goes down to 71 when you look at whether they're in date or not. So people are still, it's an indication people are still not quite understanding that this has to be annual, and there's 100% still work to be done. When we looked at compliance, so the 3 areas that we talked about in that red box before, you can see that 92% now have a link on the homepage, which is fantastic, but a really poor percentage are still signed by the board. And I'd love to understand whether the remaining percent that don't do this in this group, for instance, are doing it because they haven't read the guidance, or whether because the board refused to do that. I don't know the answer to that, and it'd be a good question to all of you to understand, if you're not doing that already, why? Because it seems an easy win, and it provides an awful lot of buy-in from perhaps your senior stakeholders, and it's a really good area to just complete. And you know, this is an area we saw is consistently poor over the 3 years, which doesn't seem to be improving, which is fascinating but also worrying. So it's a sort of a question to you to make sure you're hitting those easy win areas where you can at the moment, because we found people seem to be struggling with that. In terms of quality, don't be overwhelmed by this. I'm going to break it down a little bit, but the piece of work my colleague Caroline did when she assessed the university statements was to break down the 6 areas that the Modern Slavery Act asked for to be included in the statement on the left-hand side. These include explaining about your organisation and your supply chain, so where you source from, how many sites you have, are you a manufacturer or are you simply a buyer and a retailer? It talks about your policies, a list of what they are, how they're implemented, how effective they are, who knows about them. It asks you to discuss your due diligence processes. What do you do to monitor the implementation of your policies and your supply chain, and link to that how you go about risk assessing, which, as we saw from M&S, can be done incredibly thoroughly and transparently. Effectiveness and KPIs, you should be setting targets each year that you publicly publish. As I said, in the spirit of the Modern Slavery Act, this is something which should be used as a real tool and an advocacy point internally for you to say, well, it's in the public domain now, we set ourselves these targets, we all need to work together to be able to report positively on the progress next year. And finally, training. What are you doing to upskill the capacity of your employees, your suppliers on this issue? So these are the 6 areas you should be considering reporting on. And what Caroline did was create a scoring system from 0 to 6 of how, I'm just making sure you can see my slide, maybe I'll change that to that, so there we go, of how they can be perceived in terms of quality of that reporting content. So if I just move on again and take an example specifically of organisation and supply chain, I'd like to invite you, just to reflect now on which of those numbers you give yourself in, if you've indeed created a modern slavery statement in the past, of how you've reported on your organisation's supply chain. There were some really poor examples, obviously, that we came across, especially in agriculture and hospitality, where sort of one line was given about the function of the business, and ultimately that's not what the guidance asks for. It wants you to be really transparent about how your business operates, where your responsibilities lie, and where the preceding modern slavery statement then will go on to discuss in terms of all those other pieces of information down the left. So to give you an idea of how you can start to self-critique your policy or your statement, and go forward, perhaps it's easy to think about each element and how thoroughly you think you're addressing it. This was the table we used. So what did we find? The good news is that existence and compliance did increase year on year. 51% in 2017, 67 in 2018, and 89 in 2018. All aspects of compliance have also increased, with the biggest improvement being in terms of visibility, but the poorest performance piece was on the requirement for board approval, as we've discussed. However, we shouldn't really celebrate, because when you consider, as we will go on to look at, the quality of the statements, in addition to both the compliance and the existence, we'll find that actually only 50% of all agricultural organisations assessed are adhering to the Act across the board, which is phenomenal, really, because when you think about the gender pay gap report as a comparison, which we've done a little bit of, the compliance of that reporting process, which all businesses are now required to report on, was at 87% on day one that the legislation landed. And we totally embrace and endorse the importance of that reporting. But what we have advised to the government, and I'm sure some of you will be aware, is that the sanctions for not responding to the Modern Slavery Act should entirely be in line with something like the gender pay gap reporting structure, which does have sanctions for non-reporting in terms of financial penalties, and we believe that that would put the Modern Slavery Act reporting on par with something as an equal human rights issue. And so, yeah, when you think about all 3 sectors, the compliance, unfortunately, is still quite poor. Touching on that then, what do I mean by it's poor? The quality is where we all fall down, really. If you look at the areas that businesses had to report on, you can see they were given scores, average scores across the 3 years we reported. Due diligence was the most high performing area in the first year, but then interestingly had the biggest drop in quality, which sort of indicates to us, we believe, that people aren't taking that progress in the due diligence process system seriously. So how can you build on your due diligence every year? What are you doing more and more? So when you find issues, like Chris highlighted you should be, how are you changing your processes, your grievance mechanisms, your response to issues year on year? And so that was an interesting downturn. Consistently weak areas to call out are the use of risk management, how you measure your effectiveness and training. And I suppose just the note on those areas, that effectiveness has always been a really hard area to manage for human rights issues. They're quite intangible, but that's all about setting yourself KPIs in the same way you'd set KPIs for any other area of your business. So if you ever have the opportunity as someone who potentially writes your modern slavery statement to get your modern slavery KPIs into a larger and broader KPI document, you should really try and do that, because you can guarantee they'll then be forced to be smart and be discussed at a senior level. And being able to share that within the effectiveness element of your statement will just boost that element entirely. And as you can see, it's a consistently low area of performance. So real area that you can create a standout element if you choose to. So finally, some best practice guidance. It kind of overlaps with something Chris has talked about, so I won't dwell on it too much, but for those 3 areas that were particularly poor, we put together some brief lists of elements that you should be thinking about including. So within risk management, you need to think about how you're mapping your supply chain. Is it independent? Louise talked about risk mapping an awful lot, and that was all really, really valuable. What can you take from best practice examples? Do you have clear codes of conduct, thorough labour procurement procedures? Are you working with partners that might support you on that? Have you got grievance mechanisms? And are you looking at all of your stakeholders in the right way across your supply chain? When thinking about your effectiveness, as I've just touched on, they should be detailed KPIs. They should be how many people you want to train next year, how many audits you might have done, which don't tell you everything, but are a way that you can show progress is being made. And finally, on a training perspective, we've done some work on what this looks like, because we found that the most effective training doesn't just jump in at the deep end. We're talking to your extended supply chain about all kinds of salient human rights risks, which is the point at the bottom of that list of the training, but it starts much broader. So if you can sort of stagger your training or introduce elements of this agenda into various colleague priority groups in that order, moving from, generic business ethics through to modern slavery, through to providing annual updates on these areas, and then extending that training into your supply chain, there's a real strategic way to make your training land well and be effective. And so perhaps getting help from an internal L&D team or even an external organisation to deliver that, some businesses have found really, really effective. So those are what we found and how we'd advise you address those weak areas. I hope that's been helpful, and I'm going to pass back to Colleen now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really interesting. I hope you can hear me. So we've had some questions come through from the panelists. Let me just share my screen again, if that's all right. So the first question I've had, and before perhaps I can ask some of mine, is from a panelist asking Hannah, stating that Hannah and Louise has touched on the impacts of COVID-19, and is it too early to know the modern slavery risks that this will create, or can we see some of these impacts, I guess, flowing through into modern slavery statements, and how can this be addressed? So it's an absolutely excellent question. Would one of you like to take that?
Shall I start, Hannah, and then I'm sure you're going to add in. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the reality for many businesses is that it will be causing changes in their supply chain. Now, whether or not that means that they're stopping supply for a period of time, but the way they go about that stopping supply, making sure that they honour the payments, that they ask the questions for the supplier in terms of how will they support workers at this vulnerable time, particularly when you think about extended supply chains. They're working with in countries where maybe there isn't much social protection, there isn't the same kind of health service. So really important that responsible people are asking those questions of their supply chain. But also the reality is that supply chains are under stress. It means that you'll perhaps be using contingency supplies that won't have the same checks and balances in place. So again, you know, when you come to writing the modern slavery statement, reflecting on what of those kind of crisis controls have worked well, what have not worked well, and where has potentially added different exposure will be really important to think about.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Hannah. Did you want to, Louise, Hannah, did you want to add something to that?
All I would say is to reiterate how much of an impact we anticipate it is going to have in all of the ways that Louise touched on. We can't understate just the impact that businesses are having to cope with now, and food manufacturers, but also the longer term effects of how this will affect workforces and the contingency and business continuity planning that you will have to build in when we all reflect on this. At the Rights Lab, we have built in the last week a very comprehensive research agenda to do with the impact of COVID on both modern slavery victims that are currently suffering and requiring support from governments, through to people who are potentially vulnerable to it in you know, any kind of supply chain. In my mind, there's two types of businesses at the moment. There's the ones who are continuing to operate, the grocers mostly, because they're providing food to the nation, and it's those that are upping orders, that are having to use contingency suppliers and have got increased risks in very different ways to do with how they support suppliers to implement appropriate health and safety in sites and factories that are still operating at a very high capacity. But then you've also got the other side. There's retailers that are not operating out of their brick and mortar stores. They might be operating online, but they're bound to see a reduction in the amount of product they're ordering, and the impact on those workers around the world also needs to be managed. All of these things I would expect to be addressed in a modern slavery statement. If you're thinking about risk analysis, next year's modern slavery statements would be daft not to include a mention of how your business has responded to this. And it's absolutely going to have a long-term impact on how we manage human rights in supply chains.
Very interesting. Chris, have you got anything you want to add into that?
Well, just the observation, and I concur with everything that Louise and Hannah said. You know, you have these business cycles that sometimes, you know, they oscillate over years. And of course, right now, if you have in certain sectors less consumption because of more uncertainty, you know, I don't know who's saying, you know, that SUV I've always wanted to buy, now is the perfect time. I doubt there's very many people out there right now looking to buy it now, unless there's a smoking deal. But yeah, so I think there's these business cycles, and of course, if there's the downturn, then there's less demand within supply chains, which means that, you know, you have people laid off, especially in these, let's say, less formal sectors, be it agriculture, mining, or what have you. So we're, you know, of course, you're going to see millions of people laid off. You're going to see, of course, increased migration patterns happening as a consequence. So yeah, so in terms of the ripple effects throughout supply chains and ultimately on populations that are vulnerable are going to be enormous. So definitely a big subject of study and of concern.
Thank you. I think we've got time just to answer one more question. I'm conscious that the webinar might log itself off at 1 o'clock. And just to let everybody know that a recording will be available. I just have to work out the tech piece for that. So we have a question from Liz Higgins, who's asking, what is the best practice on scope setting in your business? If your business has operations and is headquartered in the UK, but has European business entities. Who'd like to take that?
Shall I start? I mean,
yeah.
my point would be to say, ideally, you'd want to have everything in scope. But if you're starting from a standing start, defining what you have put in scope for now, and then the steps that you're taking and then next year building on that is what's important. So often what I say to businesses who I'm advising is just get started. Don't worry about the fact you don't know all the answers, but get started and be really clear about the area that you are focusing on.
Yeah, I think I'd just add that we don't know what your specific situation is, Liz, but you know, like Chris pointed out, every business is different, and understanding whether those other entities you're talking about are reporting independently, because often you have sort of sister, brother, father, mother companies all linked in strange ways, and it tends to be up to the ultimate governance how you report as a family of businesses. If they're not reporting, it'd be really important you at least mention them in that first stage of, you know, spanning out your supply chain. But of course, as Louise said, you know, you don't have to address it all in the first year, but just be clear what you are doing, and then put it in your targets to say when you will address things, so it's super transparent and you're able to hold perhaps colleagues and teams internally to account.
And I think just if I can add, I mean, I always say going back to source, which is the legislation and the guidance, is always very helpful too. So, you know, look at what the Act says. The Act is asking you to look at both your organizations and your supply chain. And there is some guidance around how you deal with parent company and subsidiaries. So do go back and look at that. I know it's complex, because I know that for many of the big, you know, complex MNEs, the corporate structure is sometimes very tricky, and can, as you know, Hannah's and Louise's mentioned, you know, that can take time and a lot of understanding of how those different corporate structures should be regarded when you are actually reporting on them. Chris, you're nodding. Did you want to add a point before?
Yeah, you read my mind. You're a genius. You know, just a few you know, minor points to Liz's question. You know, you can, of course, you can take a risk-based approach and look at, okay, where's my exposure the greatest to these practices. You can also you know, supplement that with a spend analysis. So to look at, okay, where is, let's say, my potential impact the greatest in terms of procurement. If you have, let's say, traditional supply chains, you can also look at where's my potential impact the greatest in terms of where the, let's say, most vulnerable populations, and of course, let's say, a confluence of those three factors. So I think there's ways that you can meaningfully scope your assertion, your interventions.
Mute. Thank you, Chris. So thank you, everybody. I think I'm not going to pull through any other questions, because we've literally got 1 minute. So I'll use that minute just to say thank you again to Louise, Hannah, Chris. Really fabulous. I haven't got my video on because my broadband keeps putting me in a really awkward freeze position. So you can rather live with my picture. So most of you who signed up have been on, so thank you all the participants for listening to us. Any comments you'd like to make, do send them across to hello@Ardea International. I'm happy to share that with our panelists. I'm sure all of them would be happy to take any further questions if you have them. So do send them across, and thank you. Look out for some other webinars. We've got past the first technical issues of this one, so I'm now looking forward to finding more people to come and discuss things related to human rights, sustainability, and modern slavery. So stay safe, everybody. Thank you very much for your time and effort today. God bless. Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Colleen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.